this is an issue that we've been thinking about a lot in Australia, where people say things in interviews that might cause damage, that might be legally actionable, defamatory, that might talk about illegal activities in the past, but they want to get it on the record. Maybe it's about child sexual abuse or something like that, and they want to transform the historical record, or it's about industrial misbehaviour in a workplace or whatever. And that's really tricky, because the historians in the future will want that material to do a better history. Maybe you have to be a bit patient and recognise it can't be used at the moment because of the risk to the narrator or to you as an archive in terms of defamation. But what we've done, in fact, the National Library is just transforming in Australia, is transforming its interview protocols for people like myself who are interviewing for the library. And we've introduced an interviewer summary, which is something I've been doing for years. And I'm a great fan. I think the most important document that you create for an interview isn't necessarily the time summary or the transcript. It's the interviewer summary that they write after the interview about the interview. And the interview summary, I think, has three things in it. One, it's a summary of what are the main topics and themes that were covered in this interview and how might it be useful for future researchers. Two, all about the context and relationship that shaped the interview and the things that subsequent researchers will help them understand that piece of evidence and how it was shaped. But thirdly, it's also an opportunity for the interviewer who knows what's happened in that interview to signal any difficult or problematic material, which might be defamatory or legally actionable, so that then the archive can have a look at it. And a lot of times there's nothing, but it's like a warning system for an archive, a large archive collecting a lot of interviews. The easiest way to quickly know whether there might be problematic stuff is through the interviewer summary. And then you can make decisions about whether an interview might need to be embargoed or a section of it might need to be closed, and so on and so forth. But I do think, big institutions like universities and national archives are very risk averse, probably fair enough. The examples where an institution has been sued because of defamatory material in an interview are very few and far between, even less for legally actionable. I would err on the side of historical, getting things on the record, and only be very cautious with very, very difficult stuff. But then I'm not a lawyer, but I know why lawyers are risk averse. But so it's more often it's an ethical rather than legal issue. It's about protecting when people talk about other people in ways that might be damaging within a family or within a community. You don't want your oral history interview to cause damage in that way. And those, you might want to negotiate with the narrator, the interviewer, about closing it for a while or closing a section, whatever, if that's feasible.
Yeah.
But it's a big issue. But I think it's not one to stop doing the work we do. And it's not, I think the really important thing is don't ask the hard questions, because you don't want to
don't ask the hard questions.
Don't ask the hard questions, but be ready with the pause button. If someone's about to really weigh in and say something defamatory about a powerful person who, has got the resources to sue, you might want to just have a discussion about, well, can you talk about this issue without naming names or making it obvious? So can you talk about workplace relationships rather than naming particular bosses, etc.?
Right. Yeah, I really like what you said. We are not lawyers. We are historians, and we do want to document stuff, right?
And we want to document stuff that's difficult. We want to document family violence. We want to document workplace mispractice. We want to document politicians doing terrible things. And, sometimes we might have to hold those documents off for a while, but we don't. We want to allow historians in the future to be able to have the evidence to write about those difficult histories.
Have you found
there are topics where there are not going to be documents about it? Family violence, for example.
Have you found in the last maybe 10, 15 years, the universities are changing in terms of ethics, especially, that some of the ethics forms will ask, if you are going to destroy your research materials,
we've had it's been a big issue since university ethics came in, and it's different in different parts of the world. In America, oral history seems to have got a bit of a get-out clause there from the institutional review boards. But in Australia, any university project using human subjects like oral history has to go through ethics. And yes, the ethics boards are shaped by medical research and social science research, and their model of research is anonymity. It's destruction of records after 5 years. It's short interviews usually. It's interviews in safe public places, not in people's homes. All sorts of things that cut across oral history, years of oral history practice, and a whole range of really important oral history guidelines. So actually in Australia, we've created an advice sheet for university staff and students applying for ethics clearance about how to educate their ethics board about oral history, and explaining that most oral history interviews, people don't want to be de-identified. Most oral history people want to have informed consent and decide whether or not their interviews can be preserved and whether they can be closed for a time and so on. And they certainly probably don't want them to be destroyed, because actually we're trying to recreate the archive here. We don't want to destroy them. Oral historians usually want to do interviews in the place that's most comfortable for a person, which may be their home, and they don't want to do it in a restaurant or a study room in a university library or whatever. So we've been educating our ethics boards about oral history and actually explaining we've got 50 years of ethical guidelines created by oral history associations around the world about how to manage this very complicated, very important, very sensitive relationship, so we do no harm and so people have informed consent. And my fear is that university ethics sometimes leads to unethical outcomes, basically partly because it stops people doing really good research, and because they just think the hurdles are too great. So I think it's really important to remember there is an ethics of transforming the archive and finding difficult stories. And there are ways of doing that that protect people, that avoid doing harm to people through informed consent. But the destroying, if we were required to destroy all the interviews we created for ethics clearance, then that would just be a terribly retrograde step, which hopefully and thankfully we've mostly been able to educate our ethics committees to allow us to do. I mean, ethics committees are useful because they get students and staff to think about the ethical issues, but you have to educate the committees so they understand how oral history works.
Totally agree with that. I want to talk about another of these questions I get from students, or always in my mind when I'm teaching oral history courses. I get a bit ambivalent about it because I never took any oral history course or workshop when I started.
Yeah, me neither.
Yeah.
No, I started without. I read, it was 1979, 80, and Paul Thomson's The Voice of the Past, first edition. Oral history had just come out. I read that. That was my training, and there was no courses that I could find in the early 1980s. And one of the reasons I started teaching oral history was because I was convinced that we're better oral historians if we get some training. And because it's complicated and there are a lot of things to learn, and you learn by experience, but you can also avoid a lot of terrible mistakes, whether it's in recording quality or in avoiding difficult questions or documenting your interviews. You can teach people to be much better prepared to conduct and document and prepare for oral history interviews. So yeah, anyway, I interrupted you, sorry.
No, not at all. Going to say the same thing actually. I mean, when you came to Singapore for the oral history conference about 13, 14 years ago, memory and oral history work in Southeast Asia was growing in some ways. There were people starting to interview the survivors of massacres and killings in Indonesia and subsequently Thailand. And most of the countries in Southeast Asia and even in Singapore, there have been political action, repression, detention, things like that. And many of these interviewers are not historians or oral historians, but community workers, activists. So, and I've heard from some scholars that there's oral history work is very basic. It's amateurish. Maybe it's not well according to the best practices. In cases like this, what are the tools and what are the most important things that these amateur oral historians should learn, before they step into the field?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, it's really important that they do. I mean, oral history's got a long tradition of not only happening in academic context, but happening in community-based and activist work. And so many important projects have happened as a result, including the ones that people were talking about at that conference in Singapore from all over Asia. I I think the key thing is about training and support. And so, if someone's going to conduct an interview project about, for example, I heard someone giving a talk recently about in Indonesia, massacres of Chinese Indonesian people in Indonesia during the War of Independence in the late 1940s. And this was obviously a very difficult story and became even more difficult after the massacres in 1965. And if you're an activist trying to understand and recover stories that have been suppressed for many years, it's difficult, important work. But I think, if you can do some training, if you can get, KS or me or someone to come and do a workshop with you and your other volunteer interviewers about how you deal with difficult stories, about how you create really good quality recordings, about how you document and preserve those recordings and where you might find a safe place to house those recordings, and how you might deal with the political pressures on the use of those recordings, then I think you'll be better placed to do that work. So in Australia, Oral History Australia and the state associations, we run a pretty active training program. And I reckon every time I run a course, if it's one of the open beginner oral history courses, it's a really interesting mixture now. And probably it's usually maybe if there's 20 people on the course, and a lot of them are online, and they're from all the states of Australia, probably one or two maybe academics, maybe 5 or 6, 7 or 8 students, graduate students, honours students, maybe another half a dozen people working in community oral history projects, maybe another half a dozen people working in libraries, museums, archives, media, public arts, the whole range of people who use oral history. And for me, it's a lesson that it's a very broad field. A lot of different practitioners are using oral history in different ways, and podcasting has really stretched that because a lot of people are realizing the value of asking people their stories and making podcasts. But podcasters often do very short and sometimes quite superficial interviews. So actually educating them to realize what else they could do. That means you can share that training. So the training I did with these public librarians yesterday, they're going to cascade that out in their communities and train volunteer interviewers for community-based projects. So I think training and good resources is really key, so that yes, anybody can conduct oral history interviews. You can so much better if you realize how much careful planning needs to go into it before you turn up at someone's door to do the interview, and how you can make that interview so much better if you have a bit of understanding about acoustics and recording, and if you have a bit of understanding about how to listen and how not to interrupt, etc., etc. And also if you have a bit of understanding about the different ways you might be able to document that interview afterwards to make it more usable by your project, but also for other projects if it's going to be archived. So training is key, and probably for me, half of my work as an oral historian since my first course in a country town in Victoria in 1985 for a Centre for Continuing Education in a place called Wangaratta in central Victoria. It's now almost 40 years, and I've been doing oral history training. And I think if I was thinking about the value of the work I've done as an oral historian, probably the training and training other trainers. We actually run a course called Training the Trainers to teach people to teach oral history. Has been probably the most useful thing I've done in my career. Not just with undergrads.
More than the books.
Yeah, I reckon. I think, I know that would be true of my work as a university academic as well. I reckon I've had more of an impact in the teaching of undergrads and postgrads than in all the books, because you can help transform someone in a teaching moment. You can light a spark that leads them to having a lifetime in a career as a historian or an oral historian, and they'll do stuff that you can't do. So yeah, I think teaching and training for me has always been something I've loved, and it's been a way to impart that love of oral history, but also share the experience and lessons that I've learned, both from doing it, but also from reading about it and writing books about it, and producing anthologies of writing about it, editing journals and so on. You learn a lot from hearing and reading other oral historians talking about their practice, and then you can share that learning.
Have you had any ordinary people who come to your workshops, like amateur historians or local leaders, community leaders, who have turned out to be exceptional interviewers?
Yeah, I think so. And you because most of the workshops we do practice interviews. My model now is we have our beginner course, the main online one. It's 2 consecutive Saturdays, and on the first Saturday we learn about preparing and conducting interviews, and they do little practice interviews in the class. And then in the week in between, everybody on that course has to go out and do a real interview with someone, and then they bring extracts back to the second day school, and we talk about the interviews, and they learn from doing, basically. And you can usually tell through that day whether someone's going to be a good interviewer or not, because some people just can't stop talking. People just interrupt all the time. They're not very good listeners. Whereas some people, you just think, this is a person who's really good at listening, really good at asking a follow-up question. You can get better at that, but some people are instinctively good at that, and some people are instinctively not good at that. And maybe they're better off in an archive or doing other things. But yeah, I've worked with people who've come along and they're completely new to it, and I can see them. They're going to be brilliant, and they've gone on and done wonderful, wonderful work. Absolutely. That's one of the most fulfilling, when someone you've taught their first oral history course, and you've seen since then the books that they've created, the courses that they run, the projects that they've organised and managed. That's very fulfilling.
Yeah, I want to go back to the the move from analog to digital, the use, the presence of oral history on the internet. When I was teaching the course on oral history, I had a number of links, right, per topic, per theme, of oral history sites, where students can go to evaluate how much oral history is there, and what issues it poses in terms of access, copyright, and things like that. And it seemed to me that there wasn't a lot of real content. There are some clips, short clips, very short clips, a few minutes out of hours of interviews, and many of the sites were not well maintained at all. Like 1 year later on, the link that used to work no longer works, or the page is not even there at all. Do you think there's a kind of crisis in terms of funding oral history projects on the internet?
Look, I think there's a crisis in terms of preservation and access for oral history. And we've been thinking about this a lot in Australia in recent years. And as president of Oral History Australia, it's been probably my main concern. We used to think that the big issue about preservation was digitising analog, saving our cassettes and reel-to-reels. And once everything was digitised, it would be safe forever. But actually, digital files are just as vulnerable in the medium term. They fragment, they disintegrate, whatever. But also, the WAV file, that's the standard recording audio standard internationally, is eventually going to be superseded. And unless you have an oral history interview in a collection that can future-proof by moving to new platforms, hardware and software platforms, and manage the access agreement rules that have been imposed for those interviews, then those interviews are not going to be future-proofed, whether they're online or not. And so my feeling is that really the only institutions that actually are robust enough, are well-resourced enough, have the expertise, and often have a statutory responsibility to protect, will be national and state archives and museums, like the National Library in Singapore, National Library of Australia, State Library of Victoria, Museum Victoria. I wouldn't trust my university. I wouldn't trust a local library. I wouldn't trust any activist project to be able to secure the long-term future of our recordings. And that's not just about keeping them available online. That's about actually preserving the recordings for the future. And actually, in terms of keeping them online, the only institutions really that are going to be able to secure continuing access online or otherwise will also be those national archives. So, if you're looking for examples for teaching, the National Library of Australia has thousands of hours of interviews fully available to listen to, the interview, read the transcript, look at a time summary. Probably about 200 of the interviews we did for the Australian Generations Project in the 2010s are available online. But that's only because that's an institution that has the resources to keep those interviews alive, to check on if there's a takedown of an interview or someone wants to change the access rules or whatever. That's not something that a community project or someone who's created a website about their interview project, like ones that I know. I created websites for most of my oral history projects, but that's not the place that you'll be able to go back and find them, because universities move on, projects move on. We don't have time or resources to continually upgrade those websites. So the only real safe place for interviews to be archived and available online is a major national institution, unless you're the Shoah Project, and even that is now connected to a university as well. You need to be a major repository to be able to future-proof interviews and to ensure that they're properly looked after and accessible.
What do you think about YouTube?
Probably not enough. I mean, I'm of a generation that grew up before social media and all that sort of stuff, and so I'm not a person who looks at YouTube. I don't do podcasts and so on. So I'm probably the wrong person to ask. But I wouldn't trust any commercial platform as a future-proof platform because commercial imperatives change. Just like a university might say, yes, we've got this online Figshare system where you can put your interviews. I wouldn't trust a university in 25 years not to make funding cuts and to get rid of that. And I wouldn't trust, any commercial organisation, like whether it's YouTube or whatever, to future-proof material. No, I think we need national and state archives, and they're not absolutely future-proof. We know because the British Library got hacked last year, and that really endangered the collections. They didn't lose anything, but they lost their capacity for a while to make them accessible. So we know nothing is absolutely future-proof, but I'm absolutely sure that our recordings, that we want to continue to transform the historical record so that we can do historical research on the sort of topics for which oral history is critical. Those recordings need to somehow or other be preserved by institutions that can preserve and protect them and make them accessible in the long term. So I make sure that interview projects I'm doing connect to, in my case, usually the National Library of Australia, because I know then that I can always rely on them being available for other people down the future, including interviews that I did which are still closed and will be closed long after I've died. But I know that they have a system so that those interviews will become available in another 30, 40, 50 years.
Oh, okay. So your collections are with your university?
No, the Australian Generations Project is a National Library collection.
Right, okay.
Which the Australian Lives book came out of. The British Migration Project interviews, the Australian ones are in the National Library, the British ones are they're in the University of Sussex Library, but they're in the Mass Observation Archive, which is an independent archive that, again, is pretty future-proof. My First World War interviews are in the Australian War Memorial, which is a big, well-funded institution that I'm reasonably confident will preserve them. But we've got two projects going on in Victoria at the moment. One is a project to identify precarious oral history collections, which is basically any collection that isn't connected to a state institution. And the second is a project to give advice to new oral history projects about how they can best think about future-proofing their collection by connecting it to a major institution. And those two things I think are really important. Otherwise, all these interviews that we've done in community projects or in universities are going to be dead. And all of that dream about transforming the archive will be a broken dream. And we'll have wasted our time by not making them available to future generations.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult question. And the reason why I decided to do a podcast, the second podcast now, the previous one is with Karen. The other one I started earlier, a year ago, was Chronicles of Old Singapore. I mean, the other thing that I did in my classes was to get my students to look at kind of pseudo oral history projects on YouTube, on the internet. And you've got, things, I don't know, you've heard of Joe Rogan, there are many talk shows very similar to podcasts, which kind of draw upon memory, right?
Yeah.
And oral history. And they are very sustained interviews, actually. They're not short, they're not brief, but they kind of have an entertainment aspect to it. And that kind of, so I was getting the students to think about, what things can be asked and said on YouTube as opposed to an oral history interview. But there were also some oral history interview projects on YouTube, like Vietnamese immigrants to the US. There was a guy, a former officer, right, in the Vietnamese army who I think went to Australia or the US. and he came for the interview, which was shot on camera, wearing his military uniform. So that already tells you, right, the use of the video there about his identity. But I compare these, right, with the Joe Rogan's. Many of these oral history interviews had a few hundred views compared to millions, on Joe Rogan. So there's a stark choice here, right? That if we are talking about people's history and the democratization of the historical narrative, then how do we get more people, more eyeballs on these people's memories and voices, right, that Paul Thomson was talking about? So do you think there is a way to kind of adapt the modern podcast method, and bring oral history into that subject?
I mean, two ways of responding to that. One is, as a historian, if that material is preserved, it's still a useful source. And we go back to the same question: how does the context and relationship of that particular interview shape the story that's told? It may mean that it's being produced with very sharp and narrow parameters that are making it pretty problematic, because it's for entertainment value. So, I don't dismiss. I mean, as a historian, if those sources are available down the track, they may be useful, but they're also deeply problematic and need to be looked at critically. But you're right that, big name celebrity podcast shows get a big audience. And I guess, I mean, what has been interesting is that the podcasting has opened up platforms and ways of making interviews accessible and available to big audiences. When we run Oral History Awards in Victoria and nationally in Australia, and in recent years, a lot of those have been the people who've applied, nominated for the awards have been podcasters doing really interesting work and reaching audiences, but doing good work as well. Sometimes coming to our training, sometimes learning from us. So I sort of feel like, how do you compete with the big media with mega bucks? You don't, probably, but you can actually use these space to also democratize and challenge and tell different stories. So I guess, use the opportunities. Try and train people to do interviews that aren't superficial and that can be really open and broad and wide-ranging and challenging. But also be very, very wary of commercialized contexts that put out these stories as if this is the last word, but actually the stories have been profoundly shaped by the context of their production, and need to be viewed very critically and carefully, not least for the politics of the commercial organisation that's doing them. So I mean, I'm not probably my main way of using oral histories continues to be writing. I'm a writer. That's what I'm sort of good at. I have colleagues who do extraordinary things with film and radio and audio and podcast and exhibitions and museums, and I sometimes advise them, and I love seeing what they do, but it's not my expertise. And it's interesting, we're editing a handbook, a Bloomsbury Handbook of Oral History, and it includes a whole section about making histories in different media like film and radio and podcasts and exhibitions. I'm writing the chapter about writing oral history, which focuses on what are the challenges when we come to use this spoken or filmed story in text, and how do we do that? How do we turn talk into text? And then how do we grapple with the medium of the book or the medium of the article, particularly the book? How do we make the most of an oral history interview or set of interviews in the book format? Which for me is that's what my life work been doing. I've been trying different ways of doing that across the years, including with the book that came out of the Australian Generations Project, called Australian Lives, which we used 50 interviews that have been transcribed. And because the National Library has this extraordinary, if you go and listen to any interview online at the National Library, the audio is linked to the transcript or time summary, and you can move between them. And each little chunk of interview has a discrete URL. And so the ebook of the Australian Lives book, which is basically a book of Australian lives from the 1920s up until the present day, arranged thematically and by different life stages. But as you're reading the book, it's full of rich extracts from interviews. But if you're reading the book online as an ebook, every time you come to one of those interview extracts, you hit the URL, and it doesn't just have the URL, the extract embedded in the book. It actually takes you to the archive. It takes you to the interview. It plays that bit of the interview. And then if you want, you can keep listening to the rest of that interview. and hear more of it. So for me, that's a wonderful way in which the written word actually gives you access to the. We know that the audio has so much of the meaning, and you lose that in the sort of the blank face of text. So for me, that was a really exciting experiment, being able to show that you could write an oral history book that still gave access to voice and speech and the spoken word.
Mm. Do you think it's possible to make that reverse connection though? Like if you were, assessing this from whether it's a library website or, social media, you could get to a book. Would that work, you think?
What do you mean? Not quite sure how you
I
don't
mean,
quite follow.
so you begin to listen first. That's your first encounter with a voice. And then
Yeah.
you can click a link and it takes you to the book and you can read the book.
Yeah. I mean,
Mm.
I guess I probably should tell the National Library to make sure they promote the book so that people listening to any interview could click on the link and go to the book. I don't think that's happened, but they know about the book, and the book gets
Yeah.
access and used in other ways. But yeah, absolutely, that would be, yeah. If I was an archivist and I knew that researchers had used my material, I think I would probably, in every description, project description for every, in the catalogue for every project, I would probably have links to publications that have come out of that project. That would be a really sensible, useful way of showing how useful the material is. Yeah.
Mm.
And not that difficult to do these days, given that so many books are available online.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
So, Al, would you contemplate doing a podcast with one of your interviewees? Give it a try.
I would, but I guess I've reached this. You know how sometimes you reach a stage in your life where how many new tricks does this dog want to learn? Um, and I know the tricks I'm good at because I've been doing them for a long time. I love conducting interviews still, and I love teaching. Do I want to learn? I mean, new media it's
Yeah.
changing so rapidly, and I'm no terrible admission for oral history. I'm not particularly technically adept. I can learn from people to do a good interview and to edit material, but it's interesting. I often thought in retirement I'd love to do a radio show just called "Tell Me Your Story."
Mm.
And there are people who do that on radio, and I don't have the connections. I'm probably too old and it's too late. But I'd love to have a radio show, a bit like what Studs Terkel used to do, where you just have ordinary and extraordinary people and you have them for half an hour or maybe an hour on a radio program. And you just say, tell me your story. And you use the radio format or maybe the podcast format to enable someone to tell their story in a slightly more public way than the oral history interview. And, ideally you'd archive those episodes. Yeah, if ABC Radio came to me and said we'd really like to go with that, I wouldn't say no. But I'm a busy grandparent, family member, and I have a life, and I'm enjoying doing what I do as a freelance historian.
Right.
Um, so it probably won't happen. But
Keep the option
I
open, Al. Keep it open. We'll
will keep it
see.
open. I'm not closing that door. No, absolutely.
So I mean the last questions I have for you, right? Like I'm going to do what you probably don't approve of and ask you some um, clickbait questions about oral history.
Okay,
What has been the most difficult of the oral history interviews or projects you've done?
it's difficult.
Mm.
Look, every project has challenges. Australian Generations project was challenging because it was big. It was a national project, 300 interviews, long life story interviews, a team of 25 interviewers around the country, graduate students on the project, a research team of about 8 of us. It was uh, 4 different institutions, the ABC Radio, the National Library, and 2 universities. And I was managing that. That was a hard thing to manage. And we learned a lot of lessons. I realize now in a big project like that, as interviewers were conducting interviews, we really should have spent a bit of time when the first interviews came in from every interviewer to check them. Even though we advertised and we asked people before we appointed them to the project to send us examples of their interviews. So we rejected some people who were very experienced
Mm.
because we didn't like their interviews. But even so, we had people who, when we eventually listened to the interviews, we thought, that person had come out of a radio context, probably talked too much, probably could have done a better job. So big lesson I learned from that is if I'm running a project with other people doing interviews, make sure you make the time to listen to those first interviews and give them feedback to help improve their interviewing for that project. So that was a lesson learned, and there are some interviews in that project could have been a lot better if we'd taken if I'd thought about that at the time. Gee, the migration project, I loved doing the project with British migrants because I was a British migrant as well back in going to and from 2 countries. So that was an interview project I loved. But yeah, war veterans, I don't know. I've really, most of the interviews and most of the projects I've done, I've just felt very privileged that I've been able to do this work and ask these people their stories, and they've shared them and enabled me to use them. I mean, the challenges have been often in, if you like, post-production writing, when you're writing stuff and I love writing history that tells the big picture story, but also has the intimate stories that really illuminate how people live their lives and how they're shaped by historical processes and whatever. And that means, really writing intimately. And so the challenge is whether that person's identified or whether you can say things about someone and whether you're in a position to go back to them and ask about it. And then sometimes I've known I couldn't write things, or I've had to negotiate with someone. And, this book about 100 years of Australian fatherhood, I had to take out a whole chapter because the family objected to the story being used, even though I wasn't using anything that wasn't in the public domain. So dealing with those ethical more than legal challenges about how you write people's lives has probably been the most challenging part of working with oral history. And that's true whether you're working in radio or film or whatever. You have to think about that. And every time you do the work, you've got to think through, am I working fairly with this person's story? Should I share it with them? Should I give them the opportunity to change what I've written? So Moving Stories, the book I did with 4 women migrants, we worked for 10 years on their writing, and they did read everything I wrote, and they commented and suggested changes. And I think it was a better book because of that, but it took a long time because of that. And, if I was a graduate student, you don't have 10 years to produce a book like that. And most universities pressure their staff to produce things quicker than that as well. But as I said right at the start, oral history takes time, and doing it well and doing it ethically takes time as well. But it's time well spent. It's time, I've loved my time doing oral history.
Yeah. Are there oral histories that you that keep coming back to you? There are always interviews that, especially the early ones, the first ones I did, I always remember them, and there are always faces that I remember. Sometimes I misremember what they said, and then I check the transcript and they never said this.
Yes.
But I always remember their faces and their voices. Do you remember? Do you have such memories?
Yeah, I have really vivid memories of those first interviews I did with war veterans in 1983, and James McNair and Fred Farrell, Percy Bird. I can remember their faces, partly because I took photographs. So I had a photographic record as well to help me remember and consolidate that in my long-term memory. And because I worked very closely as a PhD student does with those interviews, I got to know them very well, and I wrote them and I returned to them over the years. In the British Migration Project, the 4 women that I worked with, those ones, very vividly. And we formed quite strong relationships. We had a lot of correspondence. They came to the book launch. They did conferences with me. Those are really special. And I'll share with you an example. I mean, for me, one of the most humbling moments in my career as an oral historian was one of the women in that book who I'd spent 10 years working with. I'd done interviews. I'd read all the 274 letters she wrote home to her family while she was a migrant in Australia. I'd seen her vast photograph and slide collection, and I'd written a whole chapter about her, and she'd been at a conference with me and come to a book launch. And many years later, after she died, when she died, she bequeathed all her letters to me, and I gave them to the archive. We'd had the interviews. And then a couple of years after she died, I got a phone call and then an email from a woman who said she was this person's child, and that when this person was a young woman migrant in Australia in the 1960s, she'd had this child, and because she was a young single woman without any resources and there was no child support for single women in the 60s, she'd adopted this child out. And in the interviews and in her letters to her family, she had never mentioned this. And in the book, even though the book's very intimate, she talked about relationships with men, she talked about never marrying, and so on. She never shared that with me. She never shared it with anyone, as I discovered later. She didn't tell the family. She went back to England to go back to her family. She never told anyone that she'd adopted a child out in Australia. And that for me was a humbling. And the story's got a nice end because this adopted child reconnected with the woman before she died and met her and acknowledged her, and they got to know each other. So it had a really nice ending. But for me as an oral historian, it reminded me that even though you've never got the last word and you've never got the full story, and even if you've worked really closely with someone for a long time, there may be things that they feel they need to withhold because of the stigma of being an unmarried mother, of the pain of giving up a child. Yeah, so it's just a reminder that yes, we never have the full story or the last word, and we have to be humble and recognize that when we work with interviews.
Yeah, I guess oral history keeps us grounded very much, isn't it?
Sure does. It keeps us grounded and human. You can't, when you're in an archive and you're working with letters and diaries and official records, there's a certain distance there that I think enables you to do things with those records that when you know the person, I don't think the ethical issue is really very different, but the personal relationship is different. And I think you feel like there's an extra layer of responsibility you have to treat people fairly and well.
Thank you so much, Al, for sharing with us, your journey through oral history and memory. It's been fantastic listening to you, hearing your stories, and really oral history is a craft, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's a
Yeah.
craft and not a science. It's an art and a craft and not a science because there's never a single right way to do it. It's always contextual and you always have to think about the context and the aims and whatever, but it's a craft that you can work at and get better at, but which you've always got to be on your toes because you never know what the next interview is going to be like. It's been a real pleasure talking with you, KS. Thanks so much for inviting me to come on your podcast.
I look forward to your next work and to the next edition, right, of the Oral History Reader. When is that coming
Yeah.
out?
We're working on it next year, so I guess it'll come out in 2026. And the Bloomsbury Handbook of Oral History should come out late next year. And the book 100 Years of Australian Fathering, which I've mentioned briefly in passing, that's coming out for Father's Day in Australia next September.
Wow. Is that already on the website, the book, the publisher website? I'll put a link to it.
Not yet, no, because we've only just submitted the manuscript, so it's out for review. So it'll be published in about a year's time. So not quite. And I don't think the reader or the Bloomsbury Handbook, I don't think they're on their websites yet because I think they want to be slightly more confident that it's ready to go.
Okay, I'll put links to what is available now of your work, so much of it, and then we look forward to the rest of it, right?
Great. Thank you.
Have a good day, Al.
You
See
too.
you.
Good to see you. Bye.
Bye.